Hello everybody, Julian Charles here of themindrenewed.com, coming to you as usual from the depths of the Lancashire countryside here in the UK. And welcome to TMR number 281, which is the second in a short series of interviews on the situation in Ukraine. Last time, as many of you will know, we spoke to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who shared with us his interpretation of the events and background to what's going on there. This time, for programme number 2, we welcome back to the podcast Adeyinka Makinde, who's kindly joined us a number of times in the past to talk about matters geopolitical. But just before we get on to that, like last time, I have just a few brief notes. Number one, as with the previous interview with Paul Craig Roberts, I am less interested in the moral questions surrounding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't avoid those questions altogether, but I am more interested in the historical, geographical, political background to what has happened there. Number two, like last time, I use the format where I first invite my guest to make an opening statement, putting their general position, after which I launch into asking questions, including some of a devil's advocate nature, because I think that works well to explore the issues. And number three, most important, this interview was recorded on the 8th of April 2022, so over 2 weeks ago. I haven't been able to get it edited and posted until now, largely due to the Easter holiday, so please do bear in mind that not everything that's said will be absolutely up to date. But as this interview is largely centred in historical matters, that isn't much of an issue anyway. So having said that, here is my latest interview with Adeyinka Makinde. Adeyinka Makinde trained for the law as a barrister, lectures in criminal law and public law at a university in London, UK, and has research interests in intelligence and security matters. He is regularly published online, writing on international relations, politics, military history, and has been a programme consultant for BBC World Service Radio, China Radio International, and The Voice of Russia. Adeyinka, welcome back to the programme. It's very good to be speaking with you again.
Thank you very much, Julian. Same here.
So, as I said, we talked before many times, and I recommend that people who haven't heard those previous conversations go and check those out. We've talked about Tony the issues of war crimes, extraordinary rendition, Islamic terrorism, and indeed Russia, which is going to be helpful for today's conversation, I'm sure. And I've got some of those notes in the background here. So I do particularly suggest, if people have time and have not heard it before, to go and listen to that particular one, which is TMR number 198, Russia and Britain, an enduring but fruitless rivalry. Now, last time when I spoke to Dr. Roberts, I introduced things really by asking a question about, well, how you've been keeping during this pandemic or, well, scamdemic time, whatever you want to call it. So I'll put that question to you, Adeyinka. How have you been keeping?
I've been biding my time, like everybody else, trying to cope with a fairly surreal situation for which I have my own views about. I thought a bit of it was quite unnecessary. But, you know, we've coped and we've seen ourselves through it and getting on with life, which I hope everybody else is, and you are yourself.
Yes. It's wonderful now to look out at the sunshine outside and think, I'm actually free to do pretty much what I want again, back to normal. Is it the new normal? I don't know. I don't like that phrase. It's the normal anyway. So we're going to be talking about Ukraine today, of course. Now, as I said to Dr. Roberts last time, my main objective with these interviews, conversations, is to sample the opinions of different people with expertise in this area, to ask, hopefully, also some challenging questions. I will also add that, as I said last time, I remain less interested in the moral questions about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't wish to avoid that altogether, but that's not the focus of this. I'm much more interested in understanding how the world has ended up here. So I'm primarily looking for historical, geographical, political, philosophical insight to help understand that situation. And as I said to you before the interview, I shall be asking you in large measure to respond to many of the things that Dr. Roberts said last time. So I was astonished that the invasion took place. I thought all talk of this being about to happen was essentially propaganda. I was mistaken in that, and I thought the Russians were just amassing on the border as a threat, and that wasn't going to be carried out. But it did happen. So my question to you is, did you expect that to happen, and what was your reaction to that?
Well, I was pretty astounded myself. I wasn't expecting it. It seemed something almost out of the blue. There was that build up over a number of months, probably even longer than a number of months, because there seemed to be a diffusion of the situation and then a revival of it, of Russian forces being massed on the Ukrainian border. And Vladimir Putin is a very careful, calculating person, a man actually not given to impulsive behavior, although there might be a case that might have occurred here. We still need to find out a bit more, but I was really taken aback. And I think we will need to judge things also for information that is yet to come out in the future. For instance, apparent allegation that the Ukrainian forces were massing on Donbass to finally take whatever territory was held by the separatists, and also the issue of the biolabs. So I was astounded, I have to say.
Yes, maybe come back to that business about the biolabs. Not quite sure what to make of that story. It's interesting that you bring up this possibly impulsive side to Putin's character, which I don't really think of it that way. But yeah, maybe there is something to that in this particular case. Maybe it's revealed something of that.
Well, I think that all nations will tend to have a plan of attack, even with those that may be perceived as friendly nations. I mean, just a very quick side example would be, say, the United States of America in the early 20th century. It had detailed battle plans on how to counteract the British Empire and at the same time to counteract the influence of Japan in the Pacific. Obviously, one plan of action was put through and the other wasn't, but both have been disclosed. And I think, obviously, Russia had a pre-existing battle plan of what to do with about Ukraine in the case of a conflict. And I feel that there were certain things that happened at the Munich conference where President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine mentioned the issue of Ukraine joining NATO and rearming. And I'm just wondering if that may have played a part in this trigger of Putin.
Okay, so rather like last time, I'm going to invite you to give us some background for this invasion from your own perspective. So don't feel that you have to go on for a long time like Dr. Roberts. If you don't want to, it's up to you. If you want to, please do. So I shall launch then into questions after you've given us this perspective. So, all right, here it is. Putin is the new Hitler. The invasion is totally unprovoked. And if there is any history at all behind what happened in Ukraine, the Russians have got that wrong anyway. So, discuss. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think there has to be more to this than this sort of black and white, good and evil, cartoonish portrayal that we see in the Western mainstream media. I certainly feel that you cannot just see this as a situation of American good versus Russian evil, because we're talking about Ukraine, but fundamental to any understanding of this conflict is the conflict between America and Russia. If you cannot grasp that, the reasonable person, if you cannot grasp that, then you really have no understanding of what is happening with this tragedy. So the default position of America being this force of good, of this Jeffersonian empire of liberty, in conflict with this Russian evil empire that is an authoritarian entity nestled behind an iron curtain, is really a false one. So what I will do, Julian, is to invite your listeners to examine history and contemporary events with an open mind. And those who are objective, open to reason, critical thinking, as opposed to those who are closed-minded and biased by default and dependent on the received wisdom provided by the agencies of social engineering, including the corporate mainstream media. They will be unable, if they are objective, they will be unable to ignore the compelling evidence that indicates that the United States is the author, or at least the co-author of the tragedy of Ukraine as we see it today. So before we talk about the ending of the Cold War, and the putative defeat of international communism with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the desovietization of Eastern Europe. We can even start from the perspective of geostrategy, something I've discussed on this program before, the Halford Makinde concept of land powers and sea powers, and how Makinde posited the idea of a certain group of nations or a nation controlling the world. And it's all centered on Eurasia, precisely where Russia sits. And Russia is nestled between Europe and Asia. And Makinde's thesis was that he who can command this landmass, the heartland of Eurasia, will then be able to control what he called the world island, but an entrance into the landmass of what is effectively Russia is through Eastern Europe. Certainly Ukraine fits the bill to weaken Russia, to make Russia pliant, so that the West, the United States-led West, can maintain its hegemony. One aspect is to weaken Russia through Ukraine. And I think we're seeing that now. We've been seeing this develop over the previous decades. Now, taking Makinde's theory into something more practical, we then come to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a national security advisor to Jimmy Carter and a very well-known figure in Washington, D.C., and a very influential figure at that. And Brzezinski's grand chessboard gives a good indication of how United States policy is being influenced by this geostrategic view that America needs to maintain hegemony, which unipolar world came about after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what Brzezinski was saying was that Russia needs to be intimidated into military subjugation and a political surrender of its sovereignty. So this is not out of the blue. This is something in which we can latch onto. I notice those who refer to Russia and this idea that Russia wants to recreate the Soviet Empire and the Tsarist Empire. They have little to rely on, I'm afraid. Yet there is a mass of information, including large texts such as Brzezinski's work, with many position papers, previously classified memos, and, of course, deeds on the part of American policy. So the idea is to subjugate Russia as a project, regardless of who rules Russia, whether it's so-called democratic person or an authoritarian person. The expansion of NATO is one aspect of this issue. When the Cold War ended, in a sense, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had served its purpose. And with the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, what needed to happen in Europe was a new security architecture needed to be developed. But this has all been put to waste, I will argue, by United States policy. That has included NATO expansion, disregarding an agreement between the leaders of America and the Soviet Union that NATO did not expand an inch because it was a bargain for allowing German reunification and for Germany to remain within NATO. So apart from NATO expansion, the other aspect has been the dismantling, again on the part of the Americans, of the host of nuclear treaties which had been developed during the Cold War era. Treaties such as, the various test ban treaties, but it all built up to the strategic arms limitation treaties, SALT I and SALT II. And even though SALT II wasn't ratified by the United States Senate, you still have a situation where it was honored. Now, the nuclear architecture of balance of power or balance of terror has now been dismantled. And that, again, has been through the proactive stances of the United States, which withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It installed missile shields in Eastern Europe. And also it reneged on the International Nuclear Forces Treaty. So that's the military aspect of intimidating Russia into subjugation, expansion of NATO, and this idea of dismantling of the nuclear security system. And the second aspect is economics. Again, putting pressure on Russia by provoking Russia and responding with sanctions. And I think what we do have at present is the desired end game, that all these proactive stances by the West in terms of provoking Russia, I think the late Professor Stephen Cohen put it correctly by characterizing much of America's foreign policy as being proactive, and the Russian side has been reactive to things. I think the sanctions, the imposition of sanctions has been a very telling aspect of how to subjugate Russia. And the end game, as we see it, was to provoke Russia into such a situation that they would mount a shock and awe series of sanctions, which would be designed to destroy the Russian economy and institute what they felt would be regime change. So that two-pronged aspect is my argument as to this background that is based on an issue of geostrategy, that America must maintain its hegemony in the world. And I feel this is where we are now. And if we don't have that in our background, we have no means of understanding and comprehending this tragedy that has befallen Ukraine and the world.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. So, as I said, I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here and come back at you with some of these points. All right, the first thing that I want to ask about is this very, very famous quote, this "not an inch eastward," which was this verbal, not written down, verbal promise that James Baker gave to Gorbachev back in 1990. This is often spoken about. However, I'm going to put to you a counter-argument that seems to be pretty popular at the moment, and I'm getting this from Frederick Kagan, who is an American resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a former professor of military history at the US Military Academy at West Point. And I saw him interviewed recently by, of all people, Jordan Peterson, who I mostly like. Before I say what Kagan says, I'm going to say I'm a little bit suspicious of him, not least because his brother is Robert Kagan, a neoconservative scholar, and his sister-in-law is Victoria Newland. However, I will put what he says about this. He says that this idea of the not 1 inch eastward is revisionism. He wants to clean up the history about this. And he says that that assurance was given in the context of German reunification in 1990. But at the time, the Soviet Empire was still there. That didn't end until 1991, and so, the Warsaw Pact countries were still in place, so that couldn't possibly be applied to those countries. But they were still in the Soviet Union. So what do you make of that argument?
I don't think it has much basis. It seems to me to be something more of a presumptive talking point. It's sort of muddying the waters. I think over the years, it has been established beyond doubt, because at one point, people were actually denying such a promise was made. And I think having gathered all the recollections of the parties in memoirs and actually documents that could be found in state archives, it's unquestionably the case that it was claimed that NATO should not expand. This, I think, is in itself revisionism, not the original argument that there was a pledge by the American leaders of the day, James Baker included, that NATO was not expected to expand. I mean, there's an inexorable logic there that, okay, Germany is going to be reunited, so the East, an industrial powerhouse within the Warsaw Pact, within Comecon, all of a sudden is merging with Germany to create an even bigger power in Central Europe. How this could happen without a bargain is a little befuddling. So I think there is a lot of evidence out there that does contradict this thesis by Mr. Kagan. But also, we can ride roughshod over that because we can say that, look, when NATO, the idea of NATO expansion was made in the 1990s, when the pliant Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia, there were Russian objections. That may be moving on from his specific arguments, but I would just say that there's enough documentation, archival, anecdotal, that puts a lie to Professor Kagan's argument.
Yes, I will direct listeners again to the George Washington University National Security Archive page, NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard. A very, very interesting collection of all kinds of documents there. There was one which I noted in particular, document number 2, Douglas Hurd, so the British Foreign Secretary at the time, reporting on what the German Foreign Minister had said. Now let me see if I can get that quote. All right, so the British memorandum, this is quoting Douglas Hurd, the British memorandum specifically quotes Genscher, that's the German Foreign Minister, as saying, sorry?
Hans-Dietrich Genscher.
Thank you very much. As saying, quote, that when he, that is Genscher, talked about not wanting to extend NATO, this is, by the way, this is in 1990, that when he talked about not wanting to extend NATO, that applied to other states besides the German Democratic Republic. The Russians must have some assurance that if, for example, the Polish government left the Warsaw Pact one day, they would not join NATO the next. So there was that understanding around at the time that this was on the cards and Russia needed to have that assurance.
Absolutely. And this is why Boris Yeltsin's government was up in arms about the whole thing. And more evidence that even if we remove Vladimir Putin and the current construction of Russia from the picture, this idea of the West wanting to move towards Russia and have it dismantled, just so that it does not rise as a power and it serves as a pliant avenue for Western energy needs, this is always on the agenda, disregarding whoever rules Russia. It's a project.
As we're on the subject, or as I've brought up Frederick Kagan, could I bring up another issue that he mentions that I think you did touch on in the previous conversation, and you said then that you were not convinced by the theory, but he brings it up. He's rather keen on the Third Rome theory of Russian state self-conception. So you correct me if I've got it wrong, but I mean, basically, I think this is the idea that Moscow is now somehow the true centre of Christendom, and that the centre of Christendom has shifted over the centuries from Rome, then to Constantinople, and then finally to Moscow. So now Russia has this self-conception of a special mission, an almost messianic mission for the world. And so this would help to understand Vladimir Putin's desire to remake the Russian Empire. I know you're not persuaded by that. Could you tell us something more about that theory and why you don't find it convincing?
Yes, I think I remember I did mention that in our previous discussion.
Yes.
And it appeared that there was this sort of a disconnect in terms of how the West and the East, that is Russia, developed. With the West, after the fall of the Roman Empire, you had the Middle Ages and a whole train of events leading to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Whereas with Russia, there was a continuum from Rome, at least through Byzantium, the eastern side. And as, the centuries developed, there was this conception of, Russia as being the center point of the Eastern Orthodox Church and becoming this third Rome. And throughout Russian history, I mean, certainly at the time of the Tsar, I don't think any serious argument could be made. The Tsarist Empire tried to expand on that basis, say in the late 19th century, and we get into the 20th century, we've got the Soviet Union. I'm not sure if the argument posits the ideology of Marx and Lenin as being a substitute for that. But I would only say that it is something that, yes, we need to take into consideration for reasons of balance and reasons of objective examination. But as I was saying, where we have this profundity of evidence in regard to Western intentions and this project to subjugate Russia, I don't see the opposite from Russia. All I see is Russia reacting. If you are positing yourself as this messianic force, then I think Russia would be more proactive militarily, culturally, etc. Russia has certainly resurrected the Orthodox Church and is trying to find its Christian roots. And it tries to position itself as being more of a moral force than the quote unquote decadent West, which pays heed to what Putin referred to as alternative lifestyles and other aspects of Western society. I don't think it plays out, as I said, simply because of the reactive nature of Russia to events. If there was something about it, it would only be aspirational. Just looking at Russia, I don't want to go off board too much, but just looking at Russia as a nation, look, it is very corrupt. Apparently not as corrupt as Ukraine, according to a lot of these indices that are created. It has a very high suicide rate. It has a high abortion rate. It has a declining population. Demographics are going down. And drug abuse and other things are rife there. So it may aspire to be a Christian nation. That is difficult in itself. But to sort of spread this messianic goal to impose itself on others, I would say no. And positing things within this idea of, as the late Professor Stephen Cohen put it, proactive West and the reactive Russia. Georgia, when it was under President Mikhail Saakashvili, was encouraged to attack South Ossetia, which wanted to join Russia. And Russia responded. Some of its citizens had been killed by invading Georgia. But what it did is, after some months of occupation, it withdrew from Georgia. So that, in one sense, just puts a lie to this idea about reestablishing the Soviet or the Tsarist Empire, because Georgia had been part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, for a combination of a few hundred years or thereabouts.
Yeah, so you do in fact agree with Paul Craig Roberts there that Georgia is not an indication of Russian expansionism, and therefore also the same with the Donbass, and presumably then you wouldn't anticipate that Russia would be interested in going into Moldova, using Transnistria and all that sort of thing. This isn't a pattern that you see.
Yes, I don't see that pattern. It's like taking Crimea. That was a kind of a essential minimum action that was based on advice given to Putin by his national security advisors. He didn't go for the whole of Ukraine. I mean, I think, and even now, this so-called special operation has always been geared towards the east. There's been no indication of Russia having an intention to invade the western part of Ukraine. And its military strategy appears to have been to encircle and to keep certain parts of Ukraine away from its activities in the Donbass. So even that shows you a kind of a calibration, which is not an idea of a total expansionist vision. And there's no evidence for it. That is all I will say about that.
Okay, well, let me come back to Vladimir Putin himself. Now, Kagan talks in terms of a certain paranoia that Putin himself has brought to modern Russia. So maybe we could think in terms of the Third Rome concept as something that Putin has latched onto in connection with a tradition that does in fact already exist there to some extent, and also in connection with his new relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. So maybe Putin has managed to persuade the Russian people that it should fear the West, that all the troubles of the Yeltsin era were basically caused by the West. So this, we might say, is a kind of new mentality in Russia that's sometimes called Putinism. I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to mean, but so maybe Putin himself has some form of this Third Rome mentality and is gradually building that view of the world in the Russian population. What do you think of that?
Again, I think from all the evidence, I would say a blanket no. I think certainly if he's suggesting that Putin is displaying a form of paranoia about Russian security, then he could not be further from the truth. I mean, in the sense of this being something uniquely Putin. Putin is obviously worried. Russians are worried. And this is just merely a continuum of the Russian mentality. So you need to delve into history to understand that Russia is this landmass and it doesn't have these natural barriers to protect it in terms of large mountains, wide rivers of that sort. And so therefore, in the Russian psyche, we have to go back to the tales of Prince Igor, which I think we discussed in my previous appearance on the Mind Renewed, that this idea of Russian insecurity because of persons willing to bring it down as a nation to weaken it is a real one that has covered the ages. So I would say, well, if there's any truth to that, there's nothing unique about it that is presented by Vladimir Putin. As I said, Boris Yeltsin's government was aghast and complained vigorously when the Clinton administration set out plans to expand NATO. So if we trace it throughout history, where we see Russia being invaded by powers or combination of powers, including smaller nations in league with larger nations to weaken Russia, we cannot just narrow it down to Putinism. So, you have to go back to the Mongols, the Teutonic Knights, the combination of the Polish Commonwealth and Lithuanians. Before we get to Nazi Germany, there were other forces, and now we have the American empire wanting to subjugate Russia for the reasons I've already explained.
But if we look at things from the point of view of the former Eastern Bloc countries themselves, I mean, it was their desire, so I understand, to belong to NATO. And Russia itself, and this is a point that the academic Christina Spohr, who I'll come back to in a minute probably, points out, is that Russia was a signatory to this NATO-Russian Council. So I have here in front of me the Founding Act on Mutual Relations, Cooperation and Security between NATO and the Russian Federation. And as part of that, Russia has signed to say, well, countries can choose their own security arrangements. That's up to them. So if the desire to belong to NATO came from these individual countries that were former Soviet, well, that's up to them, isn't it? So how can Russia now be complaining and saying, it's the West coming to our border? It's already said that's fine by us.
Yes, I think that cannot be just the sort of the game changer, because, of course, we have, for instance, an individual treaty between Russia and Ukraine from the 1990s, which says that both sides should not do acts which encourage destabilization of either nation or neither nation's security. So I would only say that that may be some useful evidence. Obviously, it sounds very rational to say that every nation should seek its destiny and be free to choose its associations. Unfortunately, many of these nations in Eastern Europe are only willing to accept military expansion by the United States because it brings them financial rewards and benefits. Ukraine is a good example of an Eastern European country that is being used as a client state with, of course, the ultimate aim of upsetting Russia, of getting at Russia. A good example was the missile shields which were installed. I don't know if that was in Poland and Romania, certainly designated to be installed there. And, the Americans were very duplicitous about this. They claimed that those missile shields were being installed to prevent unprovoked attacks from rogue nations like North Korea and Iran. Rogue nations from the point of view of, United States and the West. And, okay, Putin then put them up to the task and said, well, why don't we share this technology? Let's put it on the Iranian-Azerbaijani border. And of course, that request was ignored. I don't think Russia can escape its history. We have to take that into account. The massacre at Katyn was committed by the NKVD under Lavrenti Beria. And, Russia took over half of Poland after the Nazi invasion of Poland, following on the non-aggression pact, the Ribbentrop and Molotov pact. All of these things are real enough, but Russia also has in its national memory invasions from the West. And by the West, I mean Poland under Marshal Pilsudski invaded. So it's not a one-way street. They may want to join NATO, or they feel they may need to make certain security arrangements. But the feeling is that we have to go back to that issue of when the Cold War ended, NATO had no purpose. And so what needed to be done through statesmanship and statecraft was to create a new security architecture in Europe. And, just one more thing. I mean, talk about these nations being free to choose. It was on several occasions mentioned that Russia itself might join NATO.
Right.
So,
yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, it's all very well, isn't it, to point to a document like that and say, well, they've signed that. But you can't just pick out one clause in the document and say, well, they're committed to that and that's the end of it. You've got to read. Really, you should read the whole document. I haven't even done that, but just reading a little bit more of the document, it's very clear to me. The whole thing is set in a context of sharing and cooperation and openness. And yet, you were saying about these missile interceptors and the like moving across into that former Soviet area and disputes about that. Well, that doesn't speak of openness. And in fact, I found an article that possibly sheds further light on this from the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy. They speak here about what does NATO nuclear policy entail, and a little quote from them here. Despite serious concerns raised by Russia, the Bush administration pushed hard to have military bases in Poland and the Czech Republic for missile interceptors and tracking radar to support US ballistic missile defense BMD deployments. Then, moreover, these countries have privately raised the possibility that they might also join in, quote, nuclear sharing arrangements. Such developments would antagonize Russia and destabilize European security further. So, I mean, I don't know whether that's true, but taking that at face value, if there are these private conversations going on, I'm quite sure the Russians are aware of those private conversations, would think, well, this is hardly openness, this is hardly cooperation, this speaks of a betrayal behind the scenes. So that would kind of nuance this just bald statement, well, they've signed something and therefore committed to the notion that all these ex-Soviet states should be free to do exactly what they like. And, it's a much more murky situation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, it brings them financial benefits. And that to some of these nations, which were previously relatively impoverished, is, it helps their economies, it helps certain members of their elites. I was also thinking about, this focusing on just one thing. I mean, It's often said that, well, the agreement reached, about German reunification and the alleged pledge not to expand NATO wasn't reduced into writing, as if that is the be-all and end-all of things. I mean, at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the tensions were diffused, one aspect of that was that the Soviet Union would withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey. And in return, the United States would make a pledge not to try to invade Cuba. That was an agreement, and that was an agreement that was abided by. So, there are agreements that don't need to be put into writing. So it seems that, yes, certain sides to an argument will latch onto something, whereas we still need to be looking at the overall picture. And as I say, while my rationale for explaining what my views are may appear to support what the Russian claims are, I am still doing so from what I believe is a position of objectivity. In other words, all the evidence points to this idea of subjugating Russia. And again, this is regardless of whoever is in power in Russia.
Yes, I am putting to you, you say that you're being objective about this, and of course everybody will claim they're being objective about this, which is fair enough. I'm putting a number of these points to you from this academic called Christina Spohr, as I mentioned before, and no doubt she will claim to be very objective about matters, but I will just say that she was at one point a research fellow in the Secretary General's private office at NATO headquarters in Brussels. So we'll make of that what we will. Adeyinka, then what do you make of this extremely famous quote that I put to Paul Craig Roberts? So this is from Vladimir Putin speaking in 2005. Quote, "Above all, we should acknowledge that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of the century." End quote. Does that not indicate to you that he wants to rebuild not necessarily the Soviet Union, but Russia itself?
Yes, he wants to rebuild Russia, but not at the expense of taking territory or hook, line, and sinker. I think that is one statement that is latched onto, almost like Tanaka Memorial, the imaginary document that was claimed to exist about Japanese territorial demands in the Second World War, although Japan's subsequent behavior appeared to match what was in that document. You have nothing like that in regard to Russia. Basically, what Putin was saying, if people look at his speech as a whole, was saying that that was a disaster on two accounts. I mean, first of all, it was a disaster in the sense that central authority had failed in the Russian state twice within 1 century. That is a great calamity, and it's a disaster, and it's something that gnaws at the Russian psyche, because in Russia, at various intervals in its history, there have been times of chaos, like the time of the Troubles after the death of Tsar Ivan, known as the Terrible, or the Awesome in another translation.
Yes.
What Putin was saying was that the collapse therefore meant that the American empire had no counterweight. It was now a unipolar world. According to Francis Fukuyama, it was the end of history. And so it gave the Americans carte blanche to try to mold the world in the image it thought befitting of an American hegemon. And so this is where the so-called Wolfowitz doctrine comes into being. And Putin was complaining that why America invading countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, and later on, after 2005, we obviously saw Libya and the covert sponsoring of the invasion of Syria. What he was saying was that America was actually sponsoring or encouraging lawlessness, and that this obviously was affecting the world in a negative sense, that a resurrected power such as Russia could keep the United States in check. So that was one aspect of his motivations for saying that. The second aspect of that was he was basically pointing out that when it collapsed, this was another chaos, another time of trouble as occurred in Russia's past, where the people suffered a great deal. The people were exploited by foreign powers. In the past, the foreign powers were Poland and Lithuania invading Muscovy. Now it was the Americans coming over in the disguise of the Harvard boys to advise the ex-Soviet Union on how to become capitalists. And it led to the wholesale rape and plunder of Russia's resources. And the death rates heightened up, alcoholism increased, because the safety nets provided by the previous Soviet system were no longer available. And we know this affected Mr. Putin. He did admit that he had to make ends meet at one point, and he worked as a taxi driver in St. Petersburg. So, Russia was really hurting in that period. I mean, this was the rise of the oligarchs whose plunder of Russia was facilitated by their allies in the West. And so on those two accounts, the aspect of American unipolarity and the negativity that brought to world affairs by America riding roughshod over multilateral agreements. And secondly, the effect on Russia. So it's totally misunderstood and misinterpreted. probably out of ignorance, but certainly deliberately by others who should be in the know.
Well, I'm going to add one more quote to it. I mean, it's not to disagree with what you said, but just because last time I said I could only find one quote to that effect, but a listener very kindly sent me another one, which is attributed to Vladimir Putin, so I don't know whether it really is, but anyway, it goes. Whoever does not regret the collapse of the USSR has no heart, and whoever wants to restore it has no head. Now, this one is rather interesting because I then looked to find what I think is the Russian to this, and then there's a translation of that, which gives it a little nuance. Let me say that. Whoever does not regret the collapse of the USSR has no heart, and whoever wants to restore it to its former form has no head. Apparently, if it is indeed he who said it, that's what it originally was. So that's a bit ambiguous there, isn't it? That could suggest that he does in fact want to restore it, not as a communist empire, but nevertheless as an empire. But I agree, that doesn't really... these are only little quotes, and no doubt even if these were in fact his words, they may have been taken out of context again.
Yes, that's the first time I'm hearing of that. But yes, I mean, the second aspect of the quote, yes, it would seem to suggest that, and he has gone on record as saying that mistakes were made and Russia is not a communist state anymore. So, yeah, to rebuild Russia, but not, as he said, as he's claimed to have said, you wouldn't want to restore the Soviet Union if you had the correct head on. Yes, that would fit into something that is reasonable and not malevolent, I would have thought.
Yes, it depends how you interpret it, doesn't it? It is rather ambiguous, yes. Going back again to Kagan, okay, the Yeltsin years were terrible, very, very difficult for Russia. But the idea here is that it's wrong to blame the West because this really was a necessary process of the opening up of Russia, and it was going to be difficult. Once the structures were removed of the previous order, you're going to end up with people exploiting the situation. You were going to get your oligarchs and the poverty and the great wealth, etc. And just to blame the West is a mistake.
I think it could have been more calibrated, and I think we have seen this pattern in the past. I think what happened in Russia was an extreme form of what was called structural adjustments. In other words, at the end of sort of the 1970s and the coming to power of the likes of Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and Volcker, the Federal Reserve, and you get monetarism as being the dominant factor. You get in laissez-faire and you're moving away from the kind of socialism in a mild sense, sometimes in a hard sense, that was prevalent in some Western economies, you know, the Keynesian way of doing things. And the IMF also reflected that by supporting what was called development economics. When you get to the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, then you have a new form of looking at things, a more, unbridled capitalism. And so structural adjustment programs were foisted around the world. And this involved, in return for getting loans or some form of aid from the global institutions, you would have to sell your resources at rock bottom prices. And, everything would be sort of pegged to the dollar, so that your currency was essentially worthless. But this was supposed to be good. It was supposed to be beating you into shape. But it did provide a means by which Western interest would come and buy your resources at rock bottom prices. It did happen across the world. I think in Russia, what really puts a lie to things is that the social structures, if there was somebody, and there wasn't somebody in Boris Yeltsin and the people who were advising him, like the man named Chubais, they would have provided some form of a safety net. You don't go from one extreme to another. You sort of calibrate things, and that is very suspect. And I think Naomi Klein and her book, The Shock Theory, gives insight into the methods that were used. So, of course, these oligarchs, they hailed from Russia, but they were not acting in the interests of the Russian state. They were criminals, essentially, who rose to power. And at the end of the day, they were acting against Russia's interest, and a lot of Russia's resources were being extracted and redirected to the West. It was a great transfer of wealth away from Russia. And how do you apportion blame? That is obviously something that can be a talking point. But to totally blame the Russians would be not the correct thing to do. I think the Americans had the power to impose its will on Russia, and the Russians were taken advantage of. And one of the things Vladimir Putin did was to put a stop to that. Use the wealth of Russia to stabilize prices, to introduce some sort of a minimum social security system. People could get paid pensions. That sort of thing was missing from that time. And I think it's part of the proof of the pudding was that, was it Lawrence Summers, or certainly one or two people were fined for their activities in Russia. So it was a case of mass plunder, I would argue.
Mm. Okay, well, you've very helpfully guided us through a good deal about the past. Let's turn our attention now more towards the present, or the very recent past. Do you agree with Paul Craig Roberts that essentially the West has deliberately provoked Russia into this action so as to sever relations between Europe and Russia in order to protect the US-led Western empire, both economically and politically? Do you think it was deliberately provoked for that reason?
In one word, yes. But again, we mustn't forget the words of the learned scholars and diplomats of the past. We mentioned George F. Kennan in my last interview with you, the architect of containment during the Cold War. And he mentioned this idea of NATO expansion using states to prod at Russia would lead to a calamity. And Jack Matlock, an ex-US ambassador, also William J. Burns, another former ambassador, all points to what has happened in the present. And I think, I don't know if the likes of Victoria Nuland, who was involved in orchestrating what was effectively a coup d'etat in February 2014, will try to take the credit, as Brzezinski did in luring, saying the Soviet Union was lured into Afghanistan, and claim the credit now that Russia has been lured into Ukraine to bleed it dry through some sort of a long-term insurgency, which the West will support. I believe that there was a provocation simply from the point of view is that there has to be a break-in limit. And Vladimir Putin has acted, I feel, reactively, but in a very careful and calibrated way. One would have to ask, Nord Stream 2, that gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which successive US administrations were fearful of and wanted to be cancelled. Why would this happen when that project has just been completed?
Yes, it's highly suspicious, indeed.
Yes. So I think, the accumulation of the background evidence that I have given about this two-pronged military and economic approach towards Russia would give credence to the fact that Russians have been provoked. And as I say, we still need more evidence. But maybe after they have this, unfortunately, what might turn out to be a massive battle in the eastern Donbass, because I believe the Russian forces have encircled the Ukrainian forces in the east, where a lot of them were massed. I think we will be able to work out this idea of a kind of a final provocation, because that final provocation may not just have been Zelensky at the recent Munich Security Conference talking about rearming the Ukraine with nuclear weapons and joining NATO, but may actually have had something to do with a concerted effort to transfer Ukraine to transfer a lot of its military resources to the east, to actually physically retake all the parts of the Donbass region, which of course is split between the former autonomous oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk, I think we will have an idea about how many soldiers of the Ukrainian army are within the eastern part. And that would form the basis of the idea of one final provocation too much, which, of course, the Russians would find intolerable, to have the whole of Donbass overrun by Ukraine.
Can I go back to, you mentioned about Nord Stream 2 and how Washington has been very concerned about that development for many years. But is it not also the case that Moscow has been very concerned about Ukraine's potential access to vast amounts of gas, which of course would be a competitor to Russia, but also would make Ukraine a prime candidate for joining the EU and NATO? And so is there a big part of the Russian calculation actually to cut off Ukraine from those natural resources? So obviously I realise how Crimea is important from the point of view of the fleet at Sevastopol and the access through to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus, and the fact there are Russian speakers there, etc., etc. But there are these trillions of cubic meters of gas underneath the Black Sea. You've also got a lot of shale gas, I believe, on the edge of the Donbass as well. So is this a big part of the calculation to cut off those resources to make Ukraine as weak as possible?
I have no doubt that that would be a factor. I think it was going to take a good while for these resources to be put in a position where they could be extracted. It wasn't going to happen the next day. But I would agree. I would agree with that. I don't think one can put the point of view that that would not have factored in Russia's intentions, which would obviously meld in with its overall strategy of reacting to what it sees as, the militarization of Ukraine. NATO weapons and training resources against the Russian-speaking people. That's the fundamental issue here, and I think it's
is it? Can I just come back at that? Yeah. This business about the Russian-speaking people, I realise that it is an issue, and when Putin speaks, it seems to be the issue, but that would almost necessarily be the case when you're making a statement to people you want to bring up emotive issues. But I wonder just how much that really is an issue. When you think back to the fact that, the people in the Donbass were not recognised as fully independent by Russia. There were the Minsk Accords, and the idea was that the Donbass should remain part of Ukraine, but should have autonomy, etc. Was that, thinking in terms of long-term strategy, was that actually in Russia's interest not to either embrace the Donbass or to recognise its independence, because that would create a situation within Ukraine where you would almost inevitably have civil war. You would have instability. That would be all part of trying to destabilise Ukraine. I'm just not sure to what extent concern for fellow Russian speakers really is a really fundamental issue for Putin.
Yeah. I think it's certainly part of the concern. The overarching issue about Ukraine being the potential location of lethal weapons that could be used against Russia itself is a fundamental feature.
Yes.
But I think the idea of the Russian speakers, you see, there are two contrasting views here, that after what was essentially a coup d'etat in February, I know the Western narrative, mainstream narrative, is that there was a popular revolution. The corrupt Yanukovych ran off, yes, and good democratic feelings triumphed. That is unsustainable, because Yanukovych for sure was a corrupt man, but there's no way that he would have run off without being intimidated. So the starting point, before we lead on to the Donbass people and the Russian-speaking people, is that within this coup, what made it a decisive overthrow was the use of these ultra-nationalist, far-right, neo-Nazi paramilitary groups. They made the difference. Groups like Pravi Sector, Svoboda, Splenia Sprava. they actually physically got into government buildings, and they are actually believed to have sown the confusion at Maidan Square by shooting at both protesters and the police. And that was actually the difference. I mean, there's a whole welter of these far-right groups who get a lot of their ideology, not necessarily from Nazism, but also from Ukrainian nationalism. And when Ukrainian nationalism has manifested itself, it has done so in a very rabid, ugly manner, which led to pogroms against Jews, Poles, and certainly anti-Russian sentiment. So once these people played a part, I mean, there's a group called C16, which is it C14? I think C14, based on the words by a man called David Lane, a white nationalist from America, who alludes to something about protecting the white race and the future of white children. And one of the leaders was recently, or not too long ago, was speaking about Maidan and said, he basically said that in his politically incorrect way, he said that the protests would have been a gay parade without these ultranationalist groups playing a decisive role in intimidating Yanukovych and overthrowing his government. And once that happened, I don't think the people of the Donbass needed any sort of encouragement from Moscow to, first of all, be fearful and then to take up arms. Because the first thing the new regime did, this regime that was sponsored by the United States, Victoria Nuland, admitted that the United States has spent $5 billion trying to effect, quote unquote, democratic change. The first thing they did in the Rada was to ban Russian as an official language. That may have been somewhat backtracked on, but still, that atmosphere that was created a lot of fear in the East, which was manifested in Luhansk and Donetsk, not so much in Russian-dominated areas, Russian-speaking dominated areas like Odessa, where it was difficult to mount some sort of military resistance. But in Odessa, the Ukrainian ultranationalists burnt alive many Russian speakers in a municipal building. So I think that there is quite a lot to the idea of this distinct Russian-speaking people, some of the ethnic Russians, because we mustn't forget that Ukraine has been this country that has been a hodgepodge. Additions being made here and there. Crimea only became a part of Ukraine through Premier Khrushchev in 1953 or so, and after the settlements of the Second World War. The eastern part of Germany had to cede territory to Poland, and in return, Poland had to cede some territory to Ukraine. So the multi-ethnicity of Ukraine is something to be factored in, and this is definitely a factor that has been taken into account by those who forecast some sort of a civil war, like William J. Burns, the ambassador, who in 2008 wrote a then confidential memo, niet means niet, to NATO expansion, saying that this would be, creating the conditions of a civil war. So I believe the people have no doubt they've been helped by Moscow. But in terms of, some sort of a self-activating mechanism for autonomy, that would have been automatically created by the events that occurred in February 2014. I mean, they were described by George Friedman, a man who is very anti-Russian, as being the most blatant coup d'etat in history. And so I think the combination of those factors of what happened to overthrow Yanukovych at Maidan, and then afterwards, incidents like the mass murder of Russians in Odessa, I think that was pointing towards a fracture, possibly an irreparable fracture. But that fracture in Ukrainian society was caused, of course, by this coup, which relied on these ultranationalists.
Yes, I very much take your point. However, I just want to throw one thing in just by way of balance, in the sense that there's a lot of criticism of these ultranationalists and neo-Nazis, and I'm no friend of ultranationalists or neo-Nazis. However, digging back into the history, one has to accept, as one not, that there is a great deal of resentment that would be centered in and collected around the Holodomor, however you pronounce that, that they would see Russia as this hateful state that allowed all this starvation to take place. And I know that in some of their minds, they would think of that as a sort of Jewish Bolshevik thing. So, that's part of the picture, isn't it? They do have this historical grudge in many cases.
That's true. Although to speak of the Holodomor, we must remember that there was mass starvation in other parts of Russia. So the extent to which that was the fault of the communist system itself, of forced collectivization, has to be taken into account. And a lot of observers have also mentioned that. In contrast, so I think there has to be some sort of a middle ground here. Certainly, a lot of the Ukrainian nationalists and the ultra-nationalists have toned down their anti-Semitism. All of a sudden, they are good far-rightists or good Nazis, but they were spewing out the typical issue of the Holodomor having been caused by a Jewish-led Bolshevik apparatus, in the case of Ukraine, by Lazar Kaganovich. But this may be where our conversation is developing to, in the sense that there is this argument that, the far right are just minuscule, they don't perform well in elections. Every country has neo-Nazis, just like Russia has neo-Nazis. Everything's hunky-dory. I would say, no, there's something under the carpet there, and it's very ugly. It's not Russian propaganda to mention this. I think while we can accept that these neo-Nazi parties and ultra-right-wing parties haven't polled magnificently, if we look at their integration into civil, political, and military structures, they have a lot of weight. They also, I believe, have the power to seize power in Ukraine. I believe that there are threats against Zelensky if he does want to reach a deal with the Russians, both to overthrow him as well as against his life, just as in the way Dmitry Yarosh, who once led Pravy Sector, threatened to overthrow President Poroshenko, the man who Zelensky beat at the polls. They are integrated. Yarosh today is an advisor to the chief of staff of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Azov battalion, who the West would want, the media would want us to say is a tiresome argument, being neo-Nazis. Well, their foundational principles are based on the Nazi creed and the role Ukrainian ultranationalists played in collaborating with the Nazis during the Second World War. And they have been integrated into the Ukraine armed forces, complete with their Wolf's Angle insignia. I mean, how is that possible? You have them being appointed to advise police chiefs in municipal areas. You have people like C-14 being given contracts to police Kiev. And when they get those contracts, they go about on pogroms against Roma gypsies. So they are very well integrated into the political, civil, and military structures of the Ukraine. So that argument about denazification, I don't believe is an overestimation. I believe it's a real and present one. And I think there's been some sort of an unholy alliance, because in the year leading up to from 2013 to 2014, you all of a sudden had people like the leader of Svoboda at the time, Ole Tainibuk, saying that he was no longer an anti-Semite, no longer a racist. How does that happen overnight, where these people suddenly pledge this thing? And Victoria Nuland was there, along with John McCain. Nuland was handing out cookies at Maidan. But, in the background were the privatized CIA NGOs being activated in mobilizing people in these protests and funneling resources. This is a CIA playbook that goes back to the time when Mossadegh was overthrown by Operation Ajax in Iran. And you have this situation where Victoria Nuland herself, who is Jewish, as you mentioned, she's married to Robert Kagan, who formed an arch neoconservative, who was part of the now defunct Project for the New American Century. And she's shaking hands and meeting with far-right people of Svoboda. You have at present Ihor Kolomoisky, a Jewish oligarch, a very powerful man, but a very ruthless and corrupt oligarch. He's the, if I could say colloquially, he's the political sugar daddy of Mr. Zelensky in terms of sponsoring him. Well, Kolomoisky sponsored a lot of these far-right groups, like the Azov Battalion. How does one explain this? How does one explain a recent interview by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, where a person, a Jewish person of substance in Ukraine is saying that, well, there's nothing wrong with these ultranationalist groups because they do not attack Jews and they do not attack Jewish institutions. We have Zelensky saying the same thing. It's cool to support Bandera. There's nothing wrong with that. Just a few days ago, he gave a speech to the Greek parliament and brought an ethnic Greek member of the Azov battalion to speak to the Greek parliament, which a lot of Greek people felt was very offensive since Greece suffered a lot during the Second World War. So, I'm not going to take it any further, but I will just put those points out there and let people concentrate their minds on that and make their minds up about what has happened in Ukraine.
Yes, it's often said, isn't it, that because Zelensky is Jewish, none of these concerns are of any significance, which is far too simplistic. And of course, it brings up the question as to what it means to be Jewish, just as what it means to be Christian. You could say, well, so-and-so supports such policies, and yet they say they're a Christian. Well, what does that even mean? Cultural Christian? A professing Christian? There are so many questions embedded in there. But going back to what you were saying about this denazification thing, okay, so if we accept that the ultranationalists and the neo-Nazis are a significant issue in Ukraine, what about this policy of denazification that Putin talks about? I'm not quite sure what that means. And if I think through to what might be the logical conclusion of that, is he actually saying that he wants to eradicate everybody in that country who has what he believes to be Nazi ideology? If, as you say, this is so much integrated in Ukrainian society, this would almost imply that he's talking about soldiers going in, pulling people out of their houses because they have some intelligence, possibly faulty intelligence, that they're connected to some Nazi group or ultranationalist group and dispatching them unceremoniously or whatever. There are lots of images that come to mind in connection with this phrase that I think are quite frightening. I wonder what Putin really has in mind with this.
Yeah, I think obviously it involves a change of government that will be neutral at the very minimum to Moscow, that will not appoint these people into the civil, political, and military structures. America also had its denazification program. That also came to my mind. I mean, are we going to have a sort of a Moscow-like ideological program of forcing people, indoctrinating them? From what I can see, it does appear that the goal now may be the Balkanization of Ukraine. So apart from the issues of, indoctrination, forming a government in the East and a neutral government in the rest of Ukraine, if it does turn out to be Balkanized, I think, yes, they would want to physically annihilate those of the Azov brigade. I mean, some people say it's just at a regimental level. They're not more than a few thousand Azov people, although they've been actually very critical in prosecuting the war in the Donbass, because the Ukrainian armed forces was fairly weak at the start of the conflict, and they were found to be fairly effective. So I have no doubt about that there might be homicidal intentions against anybody who is a soldier associated with the Azov people.
Yes. Can I bring up this thorny issue of the killing of civilians? Our media, of course, is full of this. It pulls on the heartstrings. And, of course, when anybody dies, whether it's a soldier or whether it's a civilian, it's a great tragedy, but particularly civilians. And I note that a British mainstream media or dinosaur media newsreader person who interviewed Sergei Lavrov, this was several weeks ago, she was putting to him the question, how can you possibly sleep at night when you know that your troops have killed children? And his response to that was, well, this is war. It's a great sadness when these things happen, but you must remember that the West invented the term collateral damage. And I thought, well, he had a point there. But on the other hand, we are getting these continual reports of deliberate targeting of civilians. I'm personally not persuaded that is an official Russian policy. I, at the moment, think that continues to be propaganda. What's your view about this, and particularly with regard to this situation in Bucha?
Yes, I think I would tend to agree that it isn't Russian policy, because I think just the whole nature of the way the war was conducted bears that out. Russia could have replicated the American NATO disposition to shock and awe tactics. They could have used precision-guided missiles and a massive Air Force bombing campaign to absolutely level Ukrainian cities at great cost of life. This is something NATO have done without compunction in parts of Iraq, for instance, and they have supported the actions of the Saudi Arabians in Yemen. The Russians were more calibrated than that. Is there a gentle war? No. It's all such a tragedy. It's all such a mess, and people will get killed. But if there's an argument in the West that this is official Russian policy as some sort of state-sanctioned policy to demoralize citizens, that cannot be the case. That cannot be the case. And it does invite the idea, as was experienced in Mariupol, that these forces in Ukraine, these ultranationalist forces, some of who are suspected of having shot at Maidan protesters and police, with that sort of mentality, may be behind some of these nefarious actions. For instance, this purported targeting of a theater and a maternity ward in Mariupol. There is evidence out there from witnesses that claim it was the Ukrainian military, the Azov battalion, who nestled guns in and around civilian areas. That Russian policy, which is all about, it's to do with Clausewitz. If you used him as an analogy, it's to destroy armies, not destroy cities, and they are there to open these corridors, as happened in Syria. And there's video evidence, verbal evidence of ethnic Greek Ukrainian citizens who were saying that they were prevented from leaving Mariupol by members of the Azov battalion. So they're using these people. And so far as the alleged massacre is concerned, I think we need more analysis and examination of what happened. It's unfortunate that the Russian request that there be a UN investigation was turned down by Britain. We definitely need that, because there are problems with chronology, there are problems with timelines. And yes, Russia was, as I mentioned earlier in this program, they were the perpetrators of the Katyn massacre of mainly Polish military officers, but other members of the intelligentsia. But we can't just take it as a gospel truth.
No.
That they, when they were withdrawing, decided to take it out on the civilians and left all the bodies strewn there. Yes. I will not accept that without some measure of detailed proof. It's not beyond anybody to act with madness, whether under control of officers or not. But I feel there's something very suspicious about the way that's developed. And I also feel that, it just needs further investigation.
I totally agree with you. It seems to me that the burden of proof very much has to be on those making that accusation, because we have a catalogue of lies that proceed from these situations, and the West is certainly not innocent to that effect.
We just need to look at Syria for that, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. With Duma in particular, yes. And on the face of it, I agree with you that it doesn't really make sense. It would be counterproductive. Why do that and provide material for Western propaganda, etc.? I don't take that. And I think the burden of proof is very much there for the West to make that case, in which case you do need to have an investigation. And the evidence that I've seen so far doesn't seem to be that compelling, really. Something's gone on. People have died, but quite how to explain that, I don't know. So, yes, I agree with you.
That phrase, "qui bono," comes to mind.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
It really does.
And there's also, bringing up what you just said, I mean, there's a useful Anglo-Saxon legal phrase about "he who asserts shall prove."
Right.
So
Yes.
I think the onus, as you correctly say, is on those who are asserting, that is the Russians.
Indeed, and he who asserts shall prove, and needs to prove really well if they have a history of lying. So, yes, absolutely.
It's actually it's a big shame. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, tuning into shortwave radio and listening to Radio Moscow, and that was really for a laugh. We knew.
Do you know, that's funny that you say that. I used to tune into Radio Tirana at Albania for a laugh, because of the stilted way they would produce everything.
Absolutely.
Celebrate how many tins of mackerel they'd produced this year. Yes.
You see, that's the thing. But now Putin refers to the West as the empire of lies. And I certainly don't see that as somebody who is inventing something there. I think he's saying something that is based on a large amount of truth. That there is a propaganda apparatus in effect. And unfortunately, the mainstream media, corporatized media, occasionally referred to as prostitutes, regurgitate this stuff, and they reproduce NATO and governmental policy without any scrutiny. At one time, the things that would come out of Moscow would be taken with a pinch of salt. There was a lot of lying, there was a lot of cover-ups, there was a lot of stage managing. Today, I think it's gone full circle, because why I brought up the idea of listening to the old broadcast from beyond the Iron Curtain was this need to ban RT and other Russian stations. If you have nothing to hide, if you have nothing to fear, because the West during the Cold War certainly were not in the habit of blocking Radio Moscow, why choose to do that now, unless you feel somewhat challenged by it? That's the only conclusion I can come to.
Absolutely. As I said in the conversation with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, I didn't actually believe this invasion of Ukraine until I saw it on RT. And that's not to say that I think, everything that's on RT is the truth and everything that's on the BBC is false. But my initial, disbelief was, I was incredulous about it. I thought, well, there's no way that's happened when I saw it on the BBC. So I had to check with those who are accused of doing it, and they were admitting to it. That's gone. That's a huge shame. And I also note in passing this business about the guards who were supposedly heroically killed on Snake Island. Around the same day, I think it was, that I tuned into RT, and there was video which was claiming to be them getting off the ship, walking back onto dry land. And I thought, what, just a minute, surely this must be Russian propaganda, or maybe it's not. And it turns out that, in fact, they were still alive. The Jerusalem Post reported on that subsequently. So, yes, it's a great pity that this balance has gone. I like to be able to watch one and the other to find out who was lying that day.
Yes, you have to look at as many sources as possible. I don't believe in censorship. No. I mean, within reason, except if people are inciting violence, etc. But if you're going to counteract anything, you need to have access to it in the first place.
As you say, it is suggestive of something to hide, isn't it? You don't want people to have any access to the narrative you're trying to cover up. Which, of course, makes you and me Putin apologists, doesn't it? Which I presume you would just see, as I do, as simply as a way of stopping people's ears from listening to what we're saying.
Absolutely. I think people need to be more critical about things. They need to exercise their critical thinking resources and question things. In the tradition of independence and freedom, you are allowed to question what your government tells you, not to be accused, to be pathologized by saying that you are this if you don't go according to the narrative. I think we've seen this more often than not, for instance, including the COVID narrative.
Yes.
There's no nuance. There's nothing in between. You know, you're a devilish anti-vaxxer, you're a Putin apologist, and you can be nothing other than what the mainstream narrative is. That is... I find it really disgusting. It's pathetic.
Yes.
And it's very sad, ultimately.
I totally agree with you. And I think there is a sense in which the establishment has benefited from all that propaganda over the last 2 years in conditioning people, though thankfully not everybody, to accept, whatever authority says is the case. It was follow the science, and now it's follow the war propaganda. So I think the fear-mongering of the last 2 years has helped to feed into the current situation as well. But let me ask you, as I said I would before we started this interview, about this question of the just war. And I will repeat that I'm not primarily interested in the moral questions about this conflict, but rather the causes and reasons for it. But it would be interesting to get your views on this. So Russia presumably doesn't consider this to be a war as such. It's not even an invasion. It's an operation as far as they're concerned, but whatever they want to call it. Nevertheless, any justification for it would need to be underpinned philosophically in a similar way. So I presume they're thinking in terms of self-defense, a long-range view perhaps of defending themselves, but also there's this idea, a much more proximal justification for the invasion as far as they're concerned, this idea of protecting others, protecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Is this, in your view, then, a just war or operation or whatever?
Well, I think the first thing to mention is that if we have recourse to what international law states, we would strictly have to say, no, it isn't. I mean, first of all, you only invade a foreign country if you do so at the behest or the approval of the United Nations through a resolution. That hasn't happened. Secondly, you invade only if there's a cause of self-defense, in an immediate fashion. So on those two counts, legally speaking, it would appear that it is an illegal action.
Right.
Although when you think about international law and the way people bend the rules, obviously what the Russians did is they bent things. And after years of the separatists pleading for recognition, the people from Lugansk and Donetsk republics pleading for recognition, overnight Putin recognizes them and then accepts their request for aid. And so in that sense, they could kind of legitimize their incursion. Certainly when it comes to Syria, I felt the Russians certainly had a right there because they were invited by the functioning central government, whereas the Americans and other parties are there illegally. Americans in the eastern part and Turkey. So that's what I would say about the legality of it. On the wider issue of, is it just? Well, if we follow our narrative, we can see how things have developed to an inevitability. It's not me giving an approval to it, but it's me seeking an understanding of what the accumulation of provocations would lead to. And I think if we just simply look at what the ambassador, William J. Burns, mentioned in his cable, Niet means Niet. It's available in WikiLeaks as an open resource. It's clear that he could see that this would lead to civil war of some form. And this is just the way in which it has occurred. And that civil war would involve Russia. It would inevitably, Burns said, involve Russia having to intervene in some fashion. So in that sense, I see not necessarily justification, but I see an understanding of the events which all parties knew would be an inevitability given the pressures that were being placed on Russia. As I said, this overarching military and economic policy towards Russia. it was always going to lead to this at some point. And unfortunately, it has led to this invasion here. So I don't justify it, but I can see it as being inevitable.
Okay.
And apart from that internal memo sent by William J. Burns, Niet means Niet, they can also look at a paper by the Rand Corporation from 2019 titled Unbalancing and Overextending Russia. It might be the other way around, overextending and unbalancing Russia. That has been the goal. And I think these think tanks do reflect the policy of the United States. In regard to Syria, you had a paper by the Rand Corporation called The Long War, which, gave a proper exposition of what was to be in terms of the interventions in Libya and Syria and the tactics of utilizing fractures in Islam, Sunni against Shia. In the same way, this paper by the Rand exposes what is being done to Russia, and it's been designed to provoke this unfortunate resort to violence.
Yes, I shall locate those documents, put them in the show notes, of course, and perhaps you could also send me something if you happen to come across it.
Yes.
Well, in connection with this, the other thing is that, of course, it has to be a last resort. And I put that to Paul Craig Roberts, and he said, well, they thought it was a last resort. Kind of dodges the question because, does he think it's a last resort? Do you think it was a last resort?
I think it was always building up to something like this. The question was, what would be the threshold, the pressure point? I think some form of Russian action would connote that this is the absolute red line. And unless you want to resort to a situation where both parties exchange nuclear weapons, what we're going to do will end it all. But of course, that doesn't factor in the issue of an insurgency. If Ukraine is going to be balkanized, it's possible that this mass exodus of refugees is in a situation where we have a lot of Ukrainians, that is, those who do not identify as Russian, leaving Ukraine, so that you're providing eastern Ukraine, probably central parts and southern part of Ukraine, with a natural demographic in favor of the Russian speakers or those who claim Russian ethnicity. And that would make it easier to make it as a kind of a final thing that ends the previous provocations. But we don't know for sure. There was always this aspect of an insurgency hanging about, which the West and the neoconservatives and the American exceptionalists wish to promote.
Yes.
And a lot of Ukrainians will willingly go for this, not just those who are on the ultra-nationalist side, but that's what they've done in the past, with for instance, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Not many people realize that after the Soviet Union had accomplished the conquest of Nazi Germany and into the Cold War years, they were still fighting against the Ukrainian Insurgent Army until the early 1950s. And during the Second World War, they killed one of Russia's most celebrated generals, General Nikolai Vatutin, a very young man when he died. So a lot of them will be geared up for this as a way in which their nationhood can be reasserted, because unfortunately, this is where Ukraine as a nation, which, through the ages, it was always difficult to calibrate this nation. The approximations in history were not really well founded as a Ukrainian state. So you have to look at the First World War, where essentially the German General Staff, headed by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, were people who actually tried to ensure the creation of a Ukrainian state. And then you fast forward to Nazi Germany, when Stepan Bandera uses the Nazi invasion as a means in which Ukrainian nationhood could be recreated. And unfortunately, we will see that Ukrainians in the past, relying on the Germans in their Revolutionspolitik, relying on Nazi Germany, now relying on NATO, will feel that this is a chance to, invent a new Ukraine, and and it's based on fighting the enemy, the Russians. It doesn't bode well for the future. So I don't think that this ends everything. Unfortunately, the impression will be that, yes, you strike and you conquer and you divide and you settle things once and for all. That is good in theory, but in practice, unfortunately, it might lead to something that is a bit more long and drawn out.
Yes, and of course it's confirmed what the media has said about Putin for so long, that he's the new Hitler. Well, there you go. There's the evidence of it now.
It's a self-fulfilling thing. You prod somebody and then they react. And I think his reactions have basically been calibrated. There was provocation from Georgia. He reacted, but withdrew from Georgia. There was a provocation in Kiev, the coup d'etat in 2014. He reacted by just taking Crimea, but nothing further. And, on and on it's gone. So Hitler wasn't a reactive person. He had his vision of Lebensraum and expansion. There's no evidence that Putin has done it. Any sort of expansion he may have done has been as a reaction to something. We can say, well, could he not have used war as a resort? Could he have maintained anything, keeping pressure on the borders, etc.?
Yes.
I don't know. At some point, the whole feeling was that things would snap.
Well, that's what I put to Paul Gregg-Roberts. I said, why can't they just hang around the border with hundreds of thousands of troops there and just poise and say, look, there's no way you're going to have any nuclear missiles on this soil. There's no way you're going to make any motion towards joining NATO. And if you do, we're pouncing. And I'm thinking, wouldn't that have had the same effect?
I think, but you're still not doing anything. You're still just threatening. It's just like Russia's use of its energy, the blackmail. They still haven't yet stop supplying Europe, which could cause, it could be devastating. I mean, Europe is already feeling effects of the blowback from its own sanctions. And I think the Russians felt that they needed to act at this point, because otherwise they would be seen as, proverbial paper tigers, saying something but not actually doing anything about it.
But then that goes to what Paul Craig-Roberts was saying, that perhaps they should indeed have cut off gas supplies. Would that not have been the way to go? That wouldn't be paper tiger activity, would it? That would be quite decisive and very, very damaging.
Yes.
But it wouldn't be so easy to spin as the work of Hitler as an invasion is.
Or to, as a murderer, because your action in war is obviously inevitably going to kill people.
Well, so is turning off gas supplies.
Yes.
But it's very indirect, isn't it? It wouldn't be quite so easy to spin that one.
Yes, it would be. That's correct. I think that may have been one resort. And if he was prepared to absorb the sanctions that have come his way, then, removing the gas, or reducing it severely, that would have been another mechanism to use. That's interesting. Something that definitely should be weighed up, because we should always see war as an evil and as a very, very last resort. And the question is, was this a last resort?
Yes. Yes, I'm still not persuaded, obviously, that it was a last resort, and I do see it as a great evil, notwithstanding all the background to this, which we've been discussing, and I'm very grateful to you for doing that. Okay, so the issue of sanctions comes up with this, of course. Sanctions have come Russia's way anyway, whatever it does. And as I said to Paul Craig-Roberts, it looks to me and to many people that this is going to backfire on the West, that this is going to be used by Russia to cement its alternative arrangements, trading arrangements, financial arrangements, the creation of even new institutions with countries that it does business with, of course, traditionally the BRICS nations, etc. And this actually might serve significantly to weaken the West. What's your view of that?
Yes, absolutely. I think these cumulative, even before this extraordinary event of the invasion of Ukraine, the policy of the West was always pushing Russia and China together, much to the detriment of the West. I just feel that if the West stands for freedom, democracy, a rules-based international order, it should have approached, and it should approach things in a much different way. But people refuse to acknowledge this. the aggression, the strive to maintain hegemony by all means, the sort of usury and practices of the global institutions or finance, America's projection of its power since the ending of the Cold War, in total disregard of international law. All of these things, especially its use of sanctions. I don't know what the figure is. I mean, we know about Venezuela. We know certainly about Iran. So we know about Syria, which the West failed in its bid to overthrow Assad. And now it's sanctioning them, which would, I presume, cost lives to Syria, apart from America's occupation of Syria's oil-producing eastern region. We've seen sanctions in Iraq, where the recently deceased Madeleine Albright said it was worth it, the death of a minimum of 500,000 children. So sanctions in themselves, they've been proven to be obviously harsh measures, but they've also been proven to not work. They've tended to actually make the person it's aimed against more self-sufficient. So indeed, as you've mentioned, what Russia will do, it will turn eastwards. This will probably inaugurate the feared rise of Eurasia, and they will create new forms of international monetary payments, new global institutions, and develop trade in different ways than we've so far been used to under the aegis of America, where dollar has been king. This has led to de-dollarization, no question about it. And it will lead probably irrevocably to the diminution of the dollar as being the de facto international reserve currency. It's backfiring in a big way, I must say.
Yes, indeed. We seem to be living in a world of increasing own goals and general craziness. Fascinating stuff, Adeyinka. As always, a delight and an education to speak with you. So much more that I could ask you about this subject, but we've been chatting a long time and I don't want to overface listeners with too much to take in one sitting, so to speak. So I am grateful to you for coming back on the programme for number 2 in this series of looking at the Ukraine crisis. I don't know how long this series will continue. It might end with number 2. Who knows? We shall see. But I'm quite sure that this business, unfortunately, will drag on for quite some time yet. So there'll probably be an opportunity to discuss this with other guests in the days ahead. So, as I say, I'm grateful to you, very grateful to you for coming on and bringing your understanding of military history and international relations and for sharing your interpretation of these events. It's great to be able once again to pick your brains on the show. So thank you ever so much indeed for your time and insights on these matters.
Thank you very much, Julian. It was a pleasure.
Show notes for this programme can be found at The Mind Renewed, themindrenewed.com. Podcast music by the brilliant Anthony Ryjakov, attribution non-commercial share alike 4.0 international. You have been listening to me, Julian Charles, and my guest, Adeyinka Makinde, and I very much look forward to speaking to you again in the near future.